The man's lip curls in disgust, his gaze sweeping over Elspeth from the worn toes of her boots to the weary slump of her shoulders. She stands on the dusty platform of Redemption's train station, the midday sun beating down without mercy, baking the shame into her skin. Mr. Alastair Finch, the man who paid her passage from the bleak orphanage in the east, prods her arm with a silver-topped cane as if she were livestock. He is a small, precise man, all starched collar and pinched features, and his disappointment is a palpable thing, thick and sour in the dry air. "This is not what was advertised," he sniffs, addressing the station master as if Elspeth were a misdelivered parcel. "The agency described a woman of modest and delicate build. This is an Amazon." A field hand, Elspeth flinches, her hands clenching the handle of her single, battered valise. She is tall for a woman, with shoulders made broad by years of hauling water and scrubbing floors. Her body is not delicate. It is sturdy, capable, built for survival. To Mr. Finch, it is a flaw, a betrayal. He turns his back on her, his voice rising with indignation. "I demand reimbursement for my expenses. This is a fraudulent transaction." A small crowd of onlookers, loafers and busybodies, begins to gather, drawn by the prospect of a spectacle. A low murmur ripples through them, punctuated by snickers. From the edge of the crowd, a cowboy leans against the support post of the general store's porch, his hat tipped low. He watches, his face unreadable, one hand resting on his hip. The station master, a man weary of disputes, shrugs. "That's between you and the agency, Mr. Finch. She's here now, but Finch is not a man to be cheated." His eyes, small and hard as pebbles, dart around, landing on the gathering crowd. An ugly idea takes root. "Fine," he declares, his voice ringing with theatrical outrage. "I paid $20 for her passage. A waste, but perhaps not a total loss. Who will give me $10 for a strong, healthy worker, guaranteed to outplow any man here?" A collective gasp, followed by a wave of cruel laughter, washes over Elspeth. She feels the world tilt, the heat turning her vision blurry. He is auctioning her, like a mule, like a sack of grain, right here, in the middle of the street. The bidding is a joke, a series of jeering offers. $1 for the giantess," someone shouts. "I'll give you 50 cents and a plug of tobacco," another cackles. Each word is a stone, and she is drowning under their weight. Then, a quiet voice cuts through the noise, calm and steady. "I'll take her," the crowd parts. The cowboy pushes off from the post and walks forward. He's not a big man, but there's a solidity to him, a stillness that commands attention. He stops before Mr. Finch, ignoring the smaller man's sputtering surprise. He reaches into his worn leather vest and pulls out a small pouch. He counts out 10 silver dollars into Finch's greedy, waiting palm. The transaction is done. The cowboy turns his cool, gray eyes to Elspeth. Her heart is hammering against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. He gestures with his head toward a wagon parked down the street. "Come on," she can't move, her feet rooted to the wooden platform by humiliation. He seems to understand. With a sigh that sounds more like patience than annoyance, he steps onto the platform. He takes her valise from her numb fingers with one hand. Then, before she can protest or even think, he hooks an arm under her knees and another around her back, lifting her off her feet as if she weighed nothing at all. The crowd falls silent. It's an act of such unexpected strength and audacity. He carries her through the gawking onlookers, his stride even and sure. As he sets her gently onto the hard wooden seat of the wagon, he leans in close, his breath warm against her ear, his voice a low rumble meant only for her, a secret shield against the world's scorn. "Perfect fit for my embrace." They faced harsh judgment, but someone saw their true value. Before this story unfolds, tell us, have you ever stood up for someone unfairly judged? If you believe in looking beyond the surface, hit like and subscribe. The words were a strange comfort, a baffling kindness in a moment of absolute degradation. He'd said them so quietly, the sound swallowed by the vast, indifferent sky, yet they echoed in the hollow space inside her. Silas. He had introduced himself with a single, gruff word once they were clear of the town's judgmental eyes, drove the wagon with a quiet focus, his hands sure on the reins. He didn't look at her. He didn't speak. The silence stretched, filled only by the rhythmic clop of the horse's hooves, the creak of the wagon wheels, and the frantic beating of Elspeth's own heart. She sat stiffly on the bench, her back ramrod straight, her hands clenched in her lap. She dared not look at him either. She studied the landscape instead, a panorama of scorched earth, hardy scrub, and distant, hazy mountains that shimmered under the oppressive sun. It was a harsh, unforgiving land, and she felt a kinship with it. She, too, was harsh and unforgiving, sculpted by a life that had offered little softness. She was a commodity, a problem to be solved. She had been sold once by an orphanage that needed her bed, sold again by a mail-order bride agency that needed its fee, and now sold a third time on a dusty street for $10 silver. This man, this Silas, had not bought a wife. He had bought a worker, just as Mr. Finch had advertised. The thought was a cold stone in her stomach. What would he expect of her? The question was a terrifying whisper in her mind. She risked a sideways glance. He was lean, dressed in faded denim and a worn cotton shirt that had been mended more than once. His face was weathered, carved by sun and wind, with lines around his eyes that could have been from squinting into the distance or from a pain she couldn't guess at. He was not handsome in the way Mr. Finch was polished and pristine, but there was a rugged integrity to his features, a sense of quiet endurance that resonated with the land around them. He seemed a part of it, not someone trying to tame it. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke, his voice raspy from disuse. Thirsty. He gestured with his chin toward a canteen hanging from the side of the wagon. Elspeth shook her head, though her throat was coated with dust. She could not accept anything from him, not yet. It felt like a debt she could not afford to incur. He didn't press the issue. He simply pulled the wagon to a halt, took the canteen for himself, and drank deeply. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and looked at her, his gray eyes direct and unblinking. For the first time, she saw something in them other than stoicism. It was a weariness, a deep-seated loneliness that startled her. "My place ain't much," he said, as if in answer to a question she hadn't asked. "It's quiet. You'll be safe there, safe." The word was foreign. Safety was a luxury she had never known. It was a locked door at the orphanage, a temporary reprieve from a matron's sharp tongue. It was not a state of being. She didn't believe him, but she nodded anyway, a small, jerky movement. It was easier than arguing. They continued on, climbing steadily into the rolling foothills. The air grew thinner, cooler. The ranch, when they finally reached it, was exactly as he'd described. It wasn't much. A small, sturdy cabin built of rough-hewn logs sat in a clearing, smoke curling lazily from its stone chimney. A modest barn stood nearby, in slightly better repair than the cabin, and a series of corrals held a handful of scrawny-looking cattle. The place looked lonely. It looked like him. It was clean, she noted as he led her inside. The single room was Spartan, containing a narrow bed in one corner, a stone fireplace, a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, and a few shelves holding basic provisions. A curtained-off alcove suggested a small sleeping area. Everything was scrubbed and orderly, but it lacked any touch of comfort or personality. It was a shelter, not a home. "You can take the alcove," he said, setting her valise down beside it. "It's not much, but it's private." He gestured to a pump in the corner. "Water's clean. There's food in the pantry. Bacon, beans, flour." He sounded like he was giving an inventory, his tone flat and businesslike. He moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. He seemed to be struggling for words. I have chores to see to. I'll be in the barn." And then he was gone, leaving her alone in the suffocating quiet of the cabin. Elspeth stood frozen in the middle of the room for a long time. The scent of wood smoke, old leather, and something uniquely male, him, filled the small space. Slowly, cautiously, she began to explore her new prison. She pulled back the curtain to the alcove. A simple cot with a thin mattress and a single, threadbare blanket lay within. It was more than she'd had at the orphanage. She ran a hand over the rough wooden table, tracing the grain with her fingertips. She peeked into the pantry. He was right. Bacon, beans, flour, a sack of potatoes, coffee, and not much else. The fare of a man who ate to live, not for pleasure. Her fear began to recede, replaced by a dull, aching weariness. He had not laid a hand on her, had not made any untoward suggestions. He had offered her water, a private space, and then he had left her alone. It was more civility than she had received all day, perhaps all year. But the debt remained. $10 silver. He had bought a worker. With a deep, shuddering breath, Elspeth untied the ribbons of her bonnet and set it on the table. She rolled up the sleeves of her drab gray dress. If she was to be a worker, then she would work. It was the only way she knew how to survive, the only way she knew how to earn her keep, to justify her own existence. She found a bucket and went to the pump, the squeal of the handle a loud protest in the stillness. The water was cold and clear, and she drank until her thirst was quenched, then drank some more. She washed her face and hands, scrubbing away the grime of the train and the filth of her public humiliation. Then, with a sense of grim purpose, she set about making the cabin a little less empty. She found a broom and swept the floor, raising a cloud of dust that spoke of long neglect in the corners. She wiped down the table and the shelves. She opened the pantry again and assessed the meager contents. There was potential here. With a little effort, she could make a decent meal. She found a small, overgrown patch of earth behind the cabin that must have once been a garden. A few stubborn herbs still clung to life. She recognized mint and thyme. It was a start. As the sun began to dip below the mountains, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, she built up the fire in the hearth. She mixed flour and water to make biscuits, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of years spent in a kitchen. She sliced bacon and put it in a skillet, the savory scent filling the cabin. When Silas finally returned, stamping the dust from his boots on the doorstep, he stopped short, his eyes wide with surprise. The cabin was warm, filled with the smell of cooking food. A plate of biscuits sat on the table, golden brown and steaming. The skillet of bacon sizzled on the hearth. He looked at the scene, then at her, his expression unreadable. Elspeth's stomach tightened. Had she overstepped? Was he angry? I made supper, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I hope that's all right. He didn't answer for a moment. He just stood there, taking it all in. Then he gave a slow, deliberate nod. He walked to the pump, washed his hands and face, and sat down at the table. Elspeth hesitated, then served him a plate of bacon and biscuits before taking a smaller portion for herself and sitting opposite him. They ate in silence. The only sounds were the clinking of forks against tin plates and the crackle of the fire. But this silence was different from the one in the wagon. It was less tense, filled not with anxiety, but with the shared, simple act of breaking bread. When he was finished, Silas pushed his plate back and looked at her, his gaze steady. Thank you, he said. The words were simple, but they landed with the weight of something much greater. It was the first time anyone had thanked her for her work. It was always just expected, her duty, her lot. That night, as she lay on the narrow cot in the dark alcove, listening to the sound of his soft breathing from the other side of the room, Elspeth allowed a tiny, fragile seed of something she couldn't name to take root in the barren soil of her heart. It was not hope, not yet, but it was something close. It was the possibility that safety was not just a locked door, but the quiet presence of a man who saw a hungry woman and offered her food, who saw a tired woman and offered her shelter, and who, in a moment of profound cruelty, had offered her the stunning, inexplicable grace of his embrace. The days that followed fell into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. Silas would rise before the sun, his movements quiet as he stoked the fire and put on a pot of coffee. The smell of it brewing would wake Elspeth, and she would emerge from her alcove to find him gone, already out in the barn or checking the fences on his rangy horse, Buck. She would make breakfast, biscuits and gravy, or fried potatoes, and leave a plate for him on the hearth to keep warm. Then, she would set about her own work. She was not idle. She had never been idle. Idleness at the orphanage meant punishment. Here, it meant something worse, the feeling of being a useless burden. She was determined to earn the $10 he had spent on her, to erase that debt one chore at a time. She scrubbed the cabin until the wooden floors shone. She mended his worn shirts, her stitches small and neat. She tackled the neglected garden with a ferocity that surprised even herself, turning over the hard-packed soil, pulling weeds, and coaxing the stubborn herbs back to life. She found a small cache of seeds in the barn, beans, squash, and corn, and planted them with the desperate hope of a farmer praying for rain. Silas never told her what to do. He never gave her a list of chores or inspected her work. He simply observed. She would feel his eyes on her sometimes as she worked in the garden, a fleeting glance from the corral as he broke a new horse, or a longer, more thoughtful gaze as she kneaded dough at the table in the evenings. He never commented, never praised or criticized. He just watched, and in his silence, Elspeth found a strange kind of freedom. No one was telling her she was too slow, too clumsy, too big. She was simply allowed to be, to work, to exist. Their conversations were brief and practical. Need more flour from town, he might say, leaving a few coins on the table. Fence is down by the creek. He'd mention, more to himself than to her, as he headed out the door. Storm's coming, he'd state, his eyes on the horizon, a signal for her to bring in the laundry she'd washed and hung on a line between two trees. Yet, in the spaces between these sparse words, something was growing. It was in the way he started leaving a small bucket of fresh milk from his one cow on the porch for her every morning. It was in the way she started adding a little extra bacon fat to his beans because she noticed he liked them that way. One afternoon, he came back to the cabin carrying a freshly killed rabbit. He skinned and cleaned it with practiced ease, then handed it to her without a word. That night, she made a rabbit stew, rich and savory with the thyme from her garden. As they ate, he cleared his throat. "This is good," he said, his eyes fixed on his plate. My ma used to make stew like this." It was the first personal detail he had ever shared, a tiny crack in the wall of his solitude. Elspeth felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. "I'm glad you like it," she replied softly. The trip to town was an ordeal she dreaded. About a week after her arrival, Silas announced they were low on supplies. "We'll go in the morning," was all he said. Elspeth's stomach twisted into a knot. To face those people again, to see their scorn and pity, was a prospect she could hardly bear. She considered asking to stay behind, but she knew that would be cowardly. Besides, she was the one who kept the inventory now. She knew what they needed. She put on her best dress, the same drab gray one she'd arrived in, but now washed and pressed, and tied her hair back neatly. As she climbed onto the wagon, she felt Silas's eyes on her. "You look fine," he said gruffly, and it was so unexpected that she couldn't think of a response. The town of Redemption was just as she remembered, dusty, tired, and judgmental. As they pulled up to the general store, the whispers started. She could feel the stares like physical blows. Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife and the town's self-appointed moral compass, stood on the porch, her arms crossed, her lips pursed in a thin line of disapproval. Mr. Finch was there, too, looking smug and self-satisfied. Elspeth kept her eyes down, her focus on the list clutched in her hand. She wanted to be invisible, to shrink herself down until she disappeared. Silas seemed oblivious to the stares, or perhaps he simply didn't care. He moved through the store with a quiet purpose, gathering sacks of flour and sugar, tins of coffee, and other necessities. Elspeth followed in his wake, pointing out the items on her list: yeast, salt, a new spool of thread. As the storekeeper, Mr. Henderson, tallied up their purchases, Mrs. Gable made her move. She glided over, her face a mask of false concern. "Silas, dear," she cooed, loud enough for everyone in the store to hear. "I do hope you're thinking about the propriety of this arrangement. It simply isn't right, a young woman like that, unchaperoned, living in your home. People are talking." Silas didn't even look at her. He continued to watch Mr. Henderson count his money. "Let him talk," he said, his voice flat. Mrs. Gable bristled, her feigned sweetness vanishing. "It reflects poorly on the whole town. And what of the girl's reputation? You have a Christian duty to see her properly situated. Perhaps at the saloon? I hear Mildred is looking for a new girl to scrub floors." The suggestion was a deliberate cruelty, a public demotion from homesteader to saloon drudge. Elspeth felt the blood drain from her face. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. Before she could react, Silas turned. He didn't raise his voice, but his words were like chips of ice. "Elspeth is not your concern, Mrs. Gable. She is my concern. And she is where she belongs." He met the woman's gaze with a look so cold and hard that she actually took a step back. He paid Mr. Henderson, gathered their supplies, and ushered a trembling Elspeth out of the store. He loaded the wagon in silence, his movements swift and angry. As he helped her onto the seat, his hand lingered for a moment on her arm, a silent, reassuring pressure. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but it was a different silence once again. It was the silence of a shared battle, a new alliance forged in the face of a common enemy. The town was no longer just her antagonist, it was theirs. When they were nearly home, Elspeth finally found her voice. "Thank you," she whispered, staring at her hands. "For what you said." He glanced at her, his profile stark against the setting sun. "Said what needed saying," he grunted. They got no right. They pulled up to the cabin as dusk settled over the valley. As Elspeth began to unload the smaller parcels, Silas came around the wagon and stopped in front of her. He looked down at the ground, then back up at her, a strange conflict playing out on his face. "That day," he began, his voice low and hesitant. "At the station. What Finch did, what they all did, it was wrong. A person ain't a piece of property. I couldn't let it happen." He was trying to explain, to make her understand that he had not bought her, but rescued her. He was trying to erase the shame of the transaction. Tears welled in Elspeth's eyes, blurring his image. No one had ever stood up for her before. No one had ever seen her as a person worthy of defense. She had always been a burden, an inconvenience, a mouth to feed. "I know," she managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. He reached out, his calloused hand hovering in the air for a moment before he gently cupped her cheek. His thumb stroked her skin, a touch so tender it made her ache. It was not a gesture of ownership or passion, but of simple, profound human connection. "You're safe here, Elspeth," he repeated, and this time, for the first time, she believed him. In the quiet solitude of the ranch, under the vast, star-dusted sky, she was finally, impossibly, safe. And she was home. Life on the ranch was a demanding partner, relentless and unforgiving, but it was also honest. The earth gave back what you put into it. A mended fence meant secure cattle. A well-tended garden meant food on the table. Hard work yielded tangible results, a truth Elspeth found deeply satisfying. Her garden flourished under her care. The squash vines snaked across the ground, their broad leaves shading the soil, and bright yellow blossoms promised a hearty crop. The beanstalks climbed the trellises she had fashioned from sticks and twine, and the corn grew tall and green. It became her sanctuary, a place where she could pour her energy and watch something beautiful and nourishing grow from nothing. Silas watched her efforts with a quiet approval that was more affirming than any words of praise. He started leaving his worn-out tools by the garden patch, their handles smoothed by his years of labor, a silent offering for her to use. One evening, he came to the cabin with a small, struggling rose bush he had dug up from a sheltered spot by the creek. He held it out to her, its roots wrapped in a damp cloth. "Thought the garden could use some color," he mumbled, avoiding her eyes. Elspeth took the bush from him, her fingers brushing his. A jolt, small but unmistakable, passed between them. She planted the rose bush at the edge of the garden, tending to it with special care. It was a fragile, hopeful thing, a spot of delicate beauty in their rugged world. It felt like a symbol of the unspoken thing growing between them. Their shared life was weaving them together in subtle, intricate ways. She learned the rhythms of his moods, the way his shoulders slumped when he was tired, the slight tightening of his jaw when a calf was sick. She knew he preferred his coffee black and his biscuits with extra butter. She learned the stories of the scars on his hands, one from a branding iron, another from a snapped rein, a third from a fight in a town he no longer visited. He, in turn, was learning her. He saw the way her face lit up when a new bud appeared on the rose bush. He noticed she hummed softly to herself when she was content, a low, sweet sound that filled the cabin's silence. He discovered her quiet strength, not just in her physical labor, but in her unwavering resilience. She had been battered by life, but she had not been broken. One sweltering afternoon, a sudden summer storm rolled in, the sky turning a bruised purple-gray. The wind howled, and rain lashed against the cabin in furious sheets. Silas had been out repairing a distant section of fence and hadn't made it back. Elspeth watched the storm from the window, her anxiety growing with each crash of thunder. She paced the small room, her hands twisting in her apron. He was alone out there, exposed to the elements. Without a second thought, she pulled on his spare oilskin slicker, which hung by the door. It was far too big for her, smelling of him, of rain and horse and earth. She grabbed a lantern, lit it, and stepped out into the tempest. The wind tore at her, and the rain soaked her dress within seconds, but she pressed on toward the barn. She had to make sure the animals were secure. She fought her way through the mud, the lantern casting a feeble, dancing light. Inside the barn, the horses were restless, their eyes wide in the gloom. She spoke to them in a low, calming voice, checking their stalls and making sure the door was securely latched against the storm. She did the same for the milk cow, her movements sure and steady despite the chaos outside. Just as she was finishing, the barn door creaked open, and Silas stumbled in, drenched and exhausted. He stopped when he saw her, his face a mixture of relief and disbelief. "Elspeth, what are you doing out here?" "I was worried," she said simply, her voice nearly lost in the roar of the wind. "I came to check on the animals." He looked around the barn, at the calm horses, the secure latches. He looked back at her, standing there in his oversized slicker, her hair plastered to her face, the lantern held steady in her hand. A wave of emotion, raw and powerful, washed over his features. He crossed the space between them in 2 long strides and pulled her into his arms. It was not a gentle embrace. It was fierce, desperate, a collision of relief and a feeling he couldn't yet name. He held her tight against his chest, burying his face in her wet hair. Elspeth, startled at first, relaxed into his hold, her arms coming up to wrap around his waist. She could feel the frantic beating of his heart, or maybe it was her own. In the heart of the storm, surrounded by the scent of rain and hay, they held each other, 2 solitary souls finding shelter not just from the weather, but from the loneliness that had defined their lives. He let her go as suddenly as he had grabbed her, stepping back, his face flushed. "We should get inside," he said, his voice thick. The walk back to the cabin was a blur of wind and rain. Inside, the fire was a welcoming beacon. They shed their wet outer layers, a new, charged awkwardness hanging in the air between them. Elspeth busied herself making coffee, her hands trembling slightly. Silas stood by the fire, staring into the flames, his back to her. The storm raged outside, trapping them in a bubble of warmth and intimacy. "You shouldn't have come out," he said finally, his voice low. "It was dangerous. You were out there," she replied, turning to face him, a coffee cup in each hand. "I couldn't just sit here." She handed him a cup, their fingers brushing again. This time, neither of them pulled away immediately. Their eyes met, and in that gaze, the unspoken thing between them became terrifyingly clear. It wasn't just gratitude or companionship. It was something deeper, something more fragile and more powerful. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world washed clean, the air crisp and cool. The tension inside the cabin, however, lingered. The physical boundary they had so carefully maintained had been breached. The memory of his arms around her, the solid feel of his chest against hers, was imprinted on her senses. Things had changed. They couldn't go back to being just a rancher and his hired help, but they didn't know how to go forward. The next few days were marked by a tender, painful awkwardness. They moved around each other with a new awareness, their conversations even more stilted than before. The easy rhythm they had found was disrupted. Elspeth felt a familiar fear creep back in. Had she presumed too much? Had his embrace been nothing more than a moment of fear-induced instinct? Silas was more withdrawn than ever, his silence heavier, freighted with unspoken thoughts. He spent longer hours away from the cabin, working himself to the point of exhaustion, as if physical labor could outrun the turmoil in his mind. The breaking point came a week later. Elspeth was in the garden, tending to her rose bush. It had sprouted a single, perfect bud, a deep, velvety red. She touched it gently, a small smile on her face. It was proof that something beautiful could grow here, could thrive against the odds. She heard footsteps and turned to see Silas standing at the edge of the garden, a grim expression on his face. In his hand, he held a letter. "It's from the circuit judge," he said, his voice flat. "He's coming through redemption next month. Mrs. Gable and some others have filed a petition." Elspeth's blood ran cold. A petition? For what? Silas wouldn't meet her eyes. He stared at the letter as if it were a venomous snake. "For your removal. They're claiming our arrangement is immoral and a blight on the community. They want the judge to place you in the care of the church, to be assigned as a laundress at the fort. It was miles away, a bleak and lonely outpost known for its harsh conditions and rough men. It was a sentence, not a placement. The world tilted, the vibrant colors of her garden seeming to fade to gray. After everything, after finding this small measure of peace, they were going to tear her away from it. The town, with its petty cruelties and self-righteous judgments, was reaching out to reclaim her, to put her back in her place. They can't, she whispered, her voice trembling. Can they? Silas finally looked at her, and the raw despair in his eyes mirrored her own. The judge, he'll listen to the preacher. He'll listen to a dozen concerned citizens before he'll listen to a lone rancher and a woman he bought for $10. The words hung in the air, ugly and stark. The transaction he had tried so hard to undo had become the very weapon they would use against them. All her work, all their quiet understanding, all the fragile trust they had built, it meant nothing in the face of a piece of paper and a town full of spite. The single red rosebud seemed to mock her, a symbol of a hope that was about to be ripped out by the roots. She looked at Silas, at the man who had shown her kindness when the world had shown her none, and saw the fight drain out of him. He believed they were already beaten, and in that moment, Elspeth knew that her quiet resilience would no longer be enough. She would have to find a strength she didn't know she possessed. She would have to fight, not just for her home, but for the man who had given it to her. The news of the judge's impending visit settled over the ranch like a shroud. The easy, comfortable silence that had grown between them was replaced by a heavy, anxious quiet. Every shared glance was freighted with the unspoken fear of their separation. Elspeth saw the defeat in Silas's posture, the way he moved as if a great weight was pressing down on his shoulders. He was a man accustomed to fighting the land, the weather, the wildness of animals. He did not know how to fight whispers and petitions, how to battle the insidious poison of public opinion. He was retreating into himself, preparing for a loss he saw as inevitable. But Elspeth had been losing her whole life. She had lost parents she couldn't remember, lost the chance at a normal childhood, lost her dignity on a train platform. She was tired of losing. A fierce, protective anger began to smolder within her, an emotion she had never allowed herself to feel. It was not just for herself, but for Silas, for the sanctuary he had built, for the fragile life they had started to create. One evening, as he sat staring into the fire, his supper untouched, she could bear the silence no longer. She pulled the other chair close to his and sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "We are not going to let them win," she said, her voice quiet but firm. He didn't look at her. "What can we do, Elspeth? It's their word against ours. I'm just a rancher with a mortgaged piece of land. They'll say you're a woman of no standing. Then we will give me standing," she declared. He turned to her then, a flicker of confusion in his weary eyes. "What are you talking about?" "Marry me, Silas." The words came out before she had fully formed the thought, a desperate, impulsive gamble. The air in the cabin crackled with the shock of her proposal. Silas stared at her as if she had sprouted a second head. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, speechless. "Don't you see?" she pressed on, her voice gaining strength. "They call our arrangement immoral. A marriage is moral. It's sanctified. It's legal. A judge can't remove a wife from her husband's home. It would give us rights. It would give me a right to be here." Silas finally found his voice, a harsh, choked sound. "I can't ask you to do that. To tie yourself to me, to this place, for convenience. It's not right. A marriage should be. It should be for love." His words were a painful admission, a confession of what he wished he could offer her, but believed he couldn't. The vulnerability in his tone broke her heart. "And what is more loving," she asked softly, leaning forward, "than protecting someone, than standing with them when no one else will? You did that for me. Let me do this for you. For us." She reached out and placed her hand over his, her touch a silent plea. His hand was rough and calloused, but it was strong. "I am not the woman Mr. Finch wanted," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I am not delicate or small. I know what I am. I am a tall, strong woman, and my hands are not soft. But this is a hard country, Silas. It needs strong women. This ranch needs a strong woman. Maybe you do, too." He looked down at their joined hands, then up at her face, truly seeing her in the flickering firelight. He saw not the oversized woman from the train platform, but Elspeth. He saw her courage, her loyalty, her fierce, unwavering spirit. He saw the woman who had calmed his horses in a storm, who had brought his dead garden back to life, who had made his empty cabin feel like a home. He saw the woman who was now offering to sacrifice her future to save him, to save them. A slow, profound realization dawned in his eyes. He had bought her to save her from shame, but she had been saving him all along, from a loneliness so deep he had forgotten what it was like to feel anything else. Elspeth, he breathed her name, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer deny. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers, his grip tight and sure. It wouldn't be for convenience. Not for me. The unspoken words hung between them, more powerful than any declaration. It was an acceptance, not just of her plan, but of everything that had grown between them in the quiet days on the ranch. They would face the judge not as a rancher and his ward, but as a husband and wife. It was a desperate gambit, a legal shield forged in the face of prejudice. But as Silas held her hand, his thumb stroking the back of hers, Elspeth knew it was more than that. It was a choice. They were choosing each other, formally and irrevocably, against the world. The plan gave them a new sense of purpose. The heavy despair lifted, replaced by a grim determination. They had a month until the judge arrived. They spent the days working with a renewed vigor, shoring up not just the fences of the ranch, but their own resolve. Silas rode to the next county, a 2-day journey, to file the marriage license with a clerk who didn't know their story, who wouldn't be swayed by the gossip of redemption. He came back with a thin gold band he had traded a prime calf for. He presented it to Elspeth awkwardly, holding the small ring in his large, weathered palm. "It's not much," he said, his standard refrain. Elspeth took the ring, its coolness a stark contrast to the warmth of her skin. It was simple, unadorned, and to her, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "It's everything," she whispered. They didn't have a real wedding. There was no preacher, no guests, no celebration. One evening, as the sun set, they stood before the hearth in the cabin. Silas took the ring and slid it onto her finger. It was a little loose, but it was there. "With this," he said, his voice husky. Wed, he had practiced the words, she could tell. He looked her in the eye, his gaze unwavering. "I will honor and protect you. Always, and I you," she replied, her own voice steady, her heart full. They were not just speaking vows to a judge they had yet to meet. They were making a promise to each other. The legality was a shield, but the promise was the truth at its core. The news of their marriage, when it reached redemption, was met with predictable outrage and suspicion. Mrs. Gable declared it a sham, a desperate ploy to legitimize a sinful arrangement. Mr. Finch scoffed, telling anyone who would listen that Silas was a fool, saddling himself permanently with damaged goods. The scorn, however, no longer touched Elspeth. The simple gold band on her finger was an anchor. She was no longer adrift. She was Mrs. Silas Croft. She had a name, a home, a husband. She belonged. The day the judge was due to arrive, a nervous energy filled the cabin. Elspeth had scrubbed the small space until it gleamed. She wore her gray dress, mended and clean, with a white apron she had sewn herself. She had even tamed her hair into a neat bun at the nape of her neck. Silas wore his one good shirt, his boots polished, his jaw set in a determined line. They stood together on the small porch as a buggy carrying 2 men crested the hill. One was Judge Morrison, a stern-looking man with a formidable white beard. The other was Reverend Gable, his face pinched with disapproval. Mrs. Gable and a small contingent of her followers, including Mr. Finch, waited at a respectful distance, their presence a silent, judgmental jury. Judge Morrison alighted from the buggy, his eyes sweeping over the modest ranch, taking in its orderly appearance. He was a man who valued hard work and self-sufficiency, and the Croft Ranch, though poor, was clearly well-tended. His gaze settled on Elspeth and Silas, standing side by side, a united front. "Mr. Croft," the judge began, his voice a low baritone. "I have here a petition from several concerned citizens of Redemption regarding your house guest." "She is not my house guest, Your Honor," Silas said, his voice clear and strong. He took Elspeth's left hand and held it up, the gold band catching the sunlight. "She is my wife." A gasp went through the small crowd of onlookers. Reverend Gable stepped forward, his face flushed with indignation. "A convenient marriage, Judge," Made only last week, after they heard you were coming. It's a mockery of a holy sacrament, designed to circumvent the moral judgment of this community. The judge turned his sharp eyes on the reverend, a hint of annoyance in his expression. The law is not concerned with the timing of a marriage, Reverend, only its legality. Do you have the certificate, Mr. Croft? Silas produced the document from his vest pocket and handed it to the judge. The man inspected it thoroughly, his brow furrowed. Elspeth held her breath. Everything hinged on this moment, on this single piece of paper. It appears to be in order, the judge said finally, handing the certificate back. He then turned his full attention to Elspeth. His gaze was intense, analytical, as if he were trying to see past her appearance to the truth of her character. Mrs. Croft, he said, the title sounding both strange and wonderful to her ears. This petition alleges that you were brought here under duress and are living in an unsuitable environment. Is this true? Are you here of your own free will? This was her moment. Her voice, when it came, was stronger than she could have hoped. I am here of my own free will. Your Honor, Mr. Finch, unable to contain himself, stepped forward. She has nowhere else to go. He bought her for $10. Ask him. He bought her like a horse. The judge's eyes narrowed, and he looked at Silas for confirmation. Silas's face hardened, but he did not flinch. I paid Mr. Finch the $10 he was demanding for her passage. Yes, Silas said, his voice ringing with conviction. I did it because he was shaming her in the street, trying to sell her like chattel because he found her not to his liking. I paid him to make him go away. I offered my home to his wife because she was alone and had nowhere else to turn. What I did was an act of decency. What he did was an act of cruelty. The simple, honest truth of his words silenced the crowd. Judge Morrison looked from Silas's earnest face to Finch's sputtering, red one. He seemed to be weighing not just the facts, but the character of the men before him. Then he turned back to Elspeth. And you chose to marry this man? Yes, sir, Elspeth said, lifting her chin. She looked directly at her husband, her heart swelling with a fierce, protective love. I chose to marry him because he is a good and honorable man. He gave me shelter when I had none. He gave me respect when I had been shown only contempt. He has never been anything but kind to me. This cabin is my home. This man is my husband, and I will not be removed from it. Her voice did not waver. She spoke with the quiet authority of a woman who knew her own worth, a worth that had been shown to her not by a mirror or by society, but by the steady, accepting gaze of the man beside her. The judge was silent for a long moment, his eyes moving between Elspeth and Silas. He saw the way they stood together, not quite touching but connected by an invisible thread of loyalty. He saw the defiance in her eyes and the protective stance of her husband. He saw a partnership, forged in hardship and solidified by affection. I see, he said finally. He turned to the waiting crowd, his voice booming with authority. The law protects the sanctity of a marriage. Mrs. Croft is in her rightful home with her husband. There is no cause for judicial intervention. He fixed Reverend Gable with a stern look. And I would advise you and your flock to find more charitable ways to occupy your time. This petition is dismissed. A stunned silence fell over the onlookers, followed by angry muttering as they began to disperse, their public spectacle ruined. Mr. Finch looked apoplectic, but a single sharp glare from the judge sent him scurrying away. Reverend Gable bowed stiffly and retreated to the buggy. Judge Morrison gave Silas and Elspeth a final, long look. A hint of a smile touched his lips. Congratulations on your marriage, Mr. and Mrs. Croft, he said, with what sounded like genuine sincerity. I wish you well. And with that, he climbed into his buggy and rode away, leaving them standing alone on the porch of their small cabin. The threat was gone. They had won. They had faced down the town, the church, and the law, and they had won. Elspeth felt a wave of dizziness, the tension of the past month draining out of her all at once. She swayed, and Silas's arm immediately went around her, steadying her. It's over, he said, his voice rough with relief. It's over, she leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, and for the first time, she allowed the tears to come. They were not tears of shame or fear, but of profound, overwhelming relief. He held her, his hand stroking her back, murmuring soft, comforting words until the storm of emotion passed. When she had finally quieted, he tilted her chin up, his thumb gently wiping the last of her tears away. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the valley. The world was quiet again, peaceful. Their world. Elspeth Croft, he said, testing the name on his tongue, a slow smile spreading across his face. It suits you, I think so, too, she whispered. He looked at her, his gray eyes full of a deep, tender emotion that took her breath away. The pretense of their marriage, the shield they had raised for the world, had fallen away, leaving only the undeniable truth of their feelings for each other. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or demand, but of homecoming. It was gentle and sure, a confirmation of every unspoken word, every shared glance, every quiet act of kindness that had passed between them. It was the sealing of the promise they had made by the fire. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers. The silence that enveloped them was the most comfortable and complete silence she had ever known. It was the silence of belonging. He looked down at her, a playful light entering his eyes for the first time she'd ever seen it. With a low chuckle, he scooped her into his arms, lifting her off her feet with the same effortless strength he had shown on that first, terrible day. She gasped, her arms flying around his neck, a laugh bubbling up from her chest. He held her close, her body fitting against his as if it were made to be there. He carried her across the threshold of the cabin, their home. As he set her down gently inside, he leaned in, his lips brushing against her ear. "See," he whispered, his voice a warm, happy rumble. "Perfect fit for my embrace." And in the golden light of the setting sun, in the heart of their small, safe world, Elspeth knew, with absolute certainty, that she was finally, truly, perfectly home. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. Her true worth was finally seen. What does true value in a person mean to you? Tell us below.